Maybe if you want, because James, I want to be respectful of your time. That maybe if you want, we could just start you and I talking a little bit. And this will also help people come back from break and welcome back into our space now so that we can share in conversation. And so, James, thank you so much for being here. I am absolutely thrilled. I'm very excited about both you and Paula. And you've been inspiring me in the work that you are doing personally, in the way that you are organizing others to be able to bring voices together. You're one of the editors of the required textbook for our class that we're teaching right now. So you possibly have noticed his name and read his piece in that book, hopefully. Did you want to say hello and maybe share, introduce yourself? Specifically, if you could introduce yourself, including sexuality in your life story and how sexuality and sensuality is present for you at this point in time.
Sure. So James Wadley, use the pronouns he, him, live here in Philadelphia with my partner, my 9-year-old son, and my cat Waffles. I did leave the door open, so Waffles may check in on me and us. And so hopefully, if it's not too intrusive, I'm asking or inviting you all to offer me and Waffles the space to be here with us today. So in terms of my story, I also one of my other identities is African-American. Both my parents are African-American. Grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and I am one of 2 kids that I know about. So growing up in Toledo, Ohio, was great space, raise a family, that sort of thing. Both my parents went to HBCUs. And so I'll share that one of the best 4 years of my life was going to Hampton University, which is an HBCU. And it was great because I couldn't walk to class any day without hugging at least 2 people. And Hampton had had more structure than what I would have wanted at that time, which meant that we had a curfew. We couldn't have other gendered persons in our rooms at any one time. But in terms of the friendships and in terms of the relationships that I had, it was great. Sexually, I'll say that growing up, my parents rarely talked about sex. Didn't ever talk about sex until I was 16-ish or so. I remember being in my bedroom, and I remember my mother coming in and throwing a box of Trojan condoms at me and saying, "Don't you bring home any babies." And I was like, "Oh, heavens no, Mom, I'm not having any sex with anybody. Why are you doing this?" And it turned out about a week later, I ended up having sex for the first time. How about that? So it might have been my mother's intuition. So going back to Hampton, with the amount of structure that we had at the institution, it was difficult to negotiate intimacy in my private time. So at the time, we didn't have cell phones. We only had phone. I was looking around for my cell phone. We didn't have cell phones. We only had, we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have phones in our room. So if I were to meet somebody and try to negotiate intimacy after we met, it just didn't happen unless we set up a mutual time that we would meet. So needless to say, and then without having a phone in my room, the only phone that we had in my dorm was at the end of the hallway. So the phone would ring, and then you walk down to the end of the hallway, and more often than not, it wasn't for me. Fast forward, when I left Hampton, again, it was a wonderful experience. When I got to my senior year, I had an interest in working on or learning more about gender identity and gender expression. And my professor at the time said, "James, if you're interested in learning about gender roles and gender identity, why don't you do something on children," which is where my interest was at. And then specifically, why don't you look at children's toy choices? So why do some kids choose trucks? Why do some kids choose dolls? And why do some kids choose whatever? So I left, so I did my capstone project my last year, and I ended up going to the University of Kentucky to continued, well, going to grad school. And in grad school, my concentration was in school psychology. So I continued to do research on gender roles and gender identity. Kentucky wanted me to work for a year before I moved into my doctoral studies. So I'll share that at the time when I was in Kentucky, God, I hope I don't step on anybody's toes, but I was there in Lexington. And for those of you who might be familiar with Lexington, it's a Midwest Southernish town. And as a 21, 22-year-old man looking for an adventure or two or three, Lexington wasn't conducive for that. And then in terms of racial demographics, at that period, Lexington was integrated, but still segregated, where you have Black folks on one side of town, white folks on another side of town, sprinkling a few Latinx folks, and that was that. So during my second year of my master's degree, I got a brochure from the University of Pennsylvania, and I just happened to be thumbing through it or whatever. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a program in human sexuality education. That's where I need to be. And that's where I need to continue my work in gender studies, looking at gender roles and gender identity. I applied and I got in, and it was probably, in terms of my relationships, it was probably the next best 6 years of my life. Working on a PhD for 6 years sucks for many different reasons, but it was so rewarding because my friends were anything other than Black, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied Christian. So there was that. So I'll always be grateful for how patient and how compassionate they were in terms of me learning. I'm sure that along the way I stepped on toes, and I'm sure I made mistakes along the way, but I tell them to this day, I'm always grateful for how they supported me during that time.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's awesome. And that's one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit is being okay with imperfection, being okay with making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's awesome. I also wanted to welcome Paula. So Paula Stone Williams. We're doing introductions right now. And so if you'd be kind enough to introduce yourself, but specifically, if you could introduce yourself in relation to sexuality and how sexuality or sensuality has played a part of your life, and how it maybe how it sits there for you at this point in time as well.
Okay, glad to be with you. I'm Paula Stone Williams. I just switched gears pretty fast. I've been working on script finalizations for TED folks for the last couple of hours, so I'm in TED mode. I'm a TED speaker. I'm a speaker on primarily gender equity. I'm also a pastor, and I'm also a pastoral counselor. So those are the main things I do in terms of who I am. As a pastor, as a pastoral counselor, as a transgender woman, as a speaker on gender equity, I find that there's not a hell of a lot of difference between my sexuality and my spirituality. I find the two are so closely related to one another that they really can't be separated. And so if I feel as a spiritual being, I also feel as a sexual being. I'm far more comfortable in this body than I was in my previous body. I don't claim to know a cisgender female sexual or spiritual or bodily experience. I come from the borderlands between genders, from the liminal space between genders, and I'm comfortable there. We'll let that suffice.
That is awesome. And when you were just talking about that you do not see a division between your sexuality and spirituality, that has a potential that others theoretically might see those divisions. And James, when you were talking about your research, you were talking about divisions and society creating divisions in genders and gender typing. And so would either of you like to unpack the way society maybe puts things forward and how you individually have engaged that, and then maybe how you, with students and with clients and with people in your congregation, how you have leaned into or pushed back against those societal pressures to divide things?
Sure. One of the things I think is really a problem for us is the term religion has gained a very negative connotation in the Western world, and I kind of wish we could return to the Jungian understanding of that, which is not a religion, but it is in fact a verb that's talking about our spirituality and our spirituality expressed in community. We are, in fact, a community-based species. Didn't take off as a species until we moved from the level of blood kin to the level of community. And what is it that brought us from the level of blood kin to the level of community? It was man's search for meaning. So think Stonehenge or the carved bodies of Rapa Nui or the burial mounds of indigenous Americans. It's our search for meaning that brought us together in community. And our spirituality then is best, I think, expressed together. And what's happened is religion has been separated out for a very long time from our sexuality instead of being integrated to our sexuality. In fact, in the world I inhabit, a lot of my clients are coming from a toxic faith background where they have been horribly injured by the purity movement and trying to see that they can integrate their spirituality with their sexuality and understand the two within the same body is well, it often ends up being a major breakthrough for my clients. And it is, in fact, part of the realities we deal with. So much of what happens in the realm of religion, and I think also in the realm of sexuality, ends up only going to the ego level. And when you're talking the ego level, you're talking about, the ego demands two things, power and safety. And I think if you can get beneath that to the level of soul, the ego is interested in power and safety. The soul is interested in the ride. And I think when we're able to get beneath that ego level that has its demands on all of us and can get to the soul level, then we find the integration of a lot of areas of our life that we did not expect to see earlier.
So I want to give James some space to be able to answer that. But I also, when you're just talking about ego and community and connection, I have some thoughts, but I want James to have space first before I jump in with anything there.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of what Paula said, is that for myself and for my clients and even for my friends and family, I discourage people from subscribing to prescribed boxes for anything. That if I live in this containment that is socially prescribed, that says you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, but you can't do that, then sometimes those boxes are limiting. But then when those ceilings and walls are taken away, now it's open to anything, where sexuality is open to anything, obviously so long as it's consensual. But when people are able to get rid of those boxes and walls and ceilings, now, at least for my clients, they have an opportunity to experience the full breadth of their humanity and possibly have a different kind of intimacy than what they may have had prior to them coming to see me. Those boxes come from obviously what society tells us, possibly what our parents tell us, possibly what our peers, and maybe even what the internet and TV tells us. But once my clients are able to move beyond those boxes and engage in a critical conversations with themselves and others, like, why do I subscribe to that? And then they give themselves permission, or we give ourselves permission. Now their sexuality can become something different.
So the idea of, Paula put forward the idea of ego, and that a lot of this comes from a place of ego, potentially in contrast to connection and community and integration. And I'm seeing a lot of shift currently, and maybe I'm hopeful mostly, but I'm seeing shift away from a hierarchical ego perspective to a multicultural perspective, to a global perspective that starts to embrace ideas of community and connection instead of, especially within biomedical ethics. That in biomedical ethics, we often have this idea of professionalism means that you need to be disconnected. It means that you need to be objective. You cannot be in community, you cannot be in connection, you cannot have an integrated holistic life with your clients. And so Do you have any feelings around those shifts that you're seeing in society currently and how we might be moving towards integration and away from ego?
I think part of that actually is reflected in the broader world of the hard sciences. We've come off of 500 years in the modern age of believing that objective truth is attainable. And now finally, as we enter what currently is called postmodernism, we understand that there's no such thing as objective truth and that it's a good thing too. And so we understand the limitations of the hard sciences in that, and then maybe begin to have a little bit more respect for what's happening in the soft sciences. We tend to think in so many specifically Western thought forms, and I was just dealing with this in the last hour with two TED Talks. Our TED Talks often are translated into up to 70 different languages, and you hear from people on all 7 continents. And we are constantly having to take cultural limitations out of those talks. Well, yeah, that'll work in New York and LA, but that's not going to work in Atlanta, nor is it going to work in Southern Europe. And to get people beyond that, it is almost always when you can remain in the realm of narrative, you know that it's going to cross over cultural lines. If you're able to remain within that part of communication that stirs the soul.
Are there specific barriers that you see in, you mentioned Atlanta and you mentioned Southern Europe. Are there specific barriers that you see in those places?
Yes, I mean, primarily my first and third TED Talks were on the subject of gender equity or inequity. And what I've heard from all 7 continents, including Antarctica. And the things I hear from, let's say, the Scandinavian countries as opposed to Romania or Bulgaria or even Italy or Greece, you find far more misogyny coming out of Southern Europe than you do out of Northern Europe. And of course, the Middle East, it ends up being much, much worse. And so the challenge for me, I spoke just yesterday to a company with offices in London, Chicago, and Singapore. How do you speak about sexual identity or gender identity or misogyny in a way that's going to speak to all 3 of those audiences? And it is, at that point, you're just challenged to try to find the commonality of humanity. And it is, in appealing to our narratives and the bodies in which we live and have our being.
So if we change, there's the risk of, with change, that we could, if we have change, what I'm hearing from you is, if we have change, there's the potential risk of invalidating ourselves, the ourselves are the ones that are creating the barriers. That there's the risk of the people that have the barriers to suddenly be invalid, and there's the fear of becoming invalid versus being the people that determine who other people can be valid or invalid.
I'm not sure exactly what you're saying with that. It does strike with me. I mean, the one thing I hear more than anything else from the women who contact me from all over the world is thank you for validating my experience. And I'm in a unique position to be able to do that, working in the corporate sector previously as a very successful, powerful, well-educated white male, and now as a woman. I believe for all of us, that sense of validation of our identity, gender identity, sexual identity, socioeconomic identity, ethnic identity. I mean, for all of us, these are core.
James, are there barriers that you feel on a personal level, professional level, or that you're seeing shifts around in the community or on the global level?
Yeah, I just had a conversation at a retreat that I was a part of. And there was a gentleman there who suggested that we need to become more familiar with the history of our profession. And so he said it a couple of times. And so then after a while, I raised my hand and I said, well, part of the history of our profession is based upon white supremacy. And I said, there's a lot of invisibility for people who don't look like you, who aren't male, who aren't white, who haven't necessarily been offered an opportunity to share their sentiments about mental health, sexual health, wellness, etc. So then my journey as an African-American male is that I move into spaces where I'm frequently the only one. And as I look across the landscape here on Zoom, I see someone who, at least one person who appears to be of African descent, but more often than not, it's just me. Whether it's at ASECT, whether it's at Quad S, whether it's at STAR, whether it's at any one of the larger bodies of sexuality, I'm usually the only one. Because I stand 6'4", and because I look halfway decent, I'm usually the only one. So then in the conversations that I have with my clients, as well as my students, we talk about being othered and then shifting how power is constructed in our field to where we, or it's an invitation, we don't necessarily look for someone to offer us anything, which is essentially how my journal and my conference started. I got tired of moving into spaces where I'm the only Black dude around. So now that we have reclaimed our power, there's a different conversation that needs to be had. And the different kind of conversation is that more often than not, I'm blessed, I'm fortunate, and obviously there's some privilege associated with it. I'm blessed and fortunate to be invited into many different spaces. And usually, as I said before, most of them are white. But then for the times that I've invited folks to the conferences that I have domestically and abroad, I usually get, well, you know what, James, I can't make it right at this time. I got to find out if something goes on. Well, you know what, I don't know if I can make it. Let me check my calendar. So then if it's one-sided, if I do all the moving and migrating into spaces that are predominantly white, and then when I invite white folks to the spaces that are predominantly Black or Latino, the relationship becomes exploitive.
Mhm.
It's exploitive.
Mhm.
Like, and then when I get to different spaces, boy, I'm over here looking for my cell phone. When I get to different spaces, you know, more often than not, again, I'm the only Black dude floating around. It's always a photo op opportunity. So you see me out in the field, come on, James, let's take a selfie. I'm in everybody's fucking pamphlet. I get invited to all the cool gigs. But then again, when the opportunity is reciprocated, like, hey, if you don't want to meet with me domestically, you can meet me in Cape Town, South Africa. You can meet me in Prague. You can meet me in Havana. We just met in San Pedro. We'll be in Montreal. Oh, no, James, I can't meet it. Oh, if you can't meet in the fall, can you meet in the spring in St. Thomas? I host 2 conferences every single year. And sometimes we'll get some white folks. More often than not, we don't. And when they come, they say, oh, yeah, James, this is awkward. I don't know if I should say anything. Well, hello, this is what it is when I show up every single time. So, you know, for me, you know, part of, you know, maintaining at least this particular identity, one of the identities that I maintain is that it's very lonely and it's isolated. And, but, you know, I try to use my own emotional or affective, cognitive, and behavioral experiences to inform how I engage others around me near and far.
And Paula, I'm thinking, as James was talking, I'm thinking about how amazing the work that you've been doing, how you've been helping, as you're saying, to help people feel valid and to welcome people in. Have you found that creating space and welcoming people to create a space that is more aligned with themselves and their personal identities, instead of them being a small percentage of a larger audience, to create a space where they become the majority, and then others might be a minority in that percentage of people?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm following your question.
Well, James was just talking about James potentially being invited to professional spaces to be a speaker, and potentially being the one of the few African-American men who is in that space, and it being a very different dynamic than when James is creating a space that is primarily African-American attendees, and there might be one or two or a few white people are there that are experiencing a shift in that dynamic, a shift in the somatic understanding of ideas of who has the privilege to speak in a space and who is owning that space. And it feels that you are similarly creating spaces where people who can be feeling very marginalized are being put in the center and feeling that they are in the center, and then they therefore have more power and privilege to speak.
I think probably the place that I'm most aware of that is in my work as a pastor in my church. And our church is, at this point, it's been really interesting to watch as it unfolds and develops. It's become primarily a queer church. And I can't say I'm crazy about that. It's like, is this what we always do? And often it is, in fact, I find we've had conversations about it, that a certain segment of our queer community are actually the ones who are sending out the vibes, not welcoming straight folk into our community, which of course I think is antithetical to the message of the gospel. It's pretty fascinating to me. When I'm out beyond that, in my setting, I'm primarily interacting with very left-leaning, very well-educated parts of the population. And there, I think the bigger frustration is that everybody wants me to know how awake they are to the specifics of my own personal experience when they don't know shit. And that just becomes. There's so many ways in which I will not live long enough to lose my white male privilege. I'm very, very well aware of that. And so I will constantly refer to myself as, one of the white guys, because I'm not ever going to live long enough to lose that privilege. But because of that, I also will purposefully place myself in situations, environments that a lot of other people who are fighting for trans rights are not about to go, because they're going to be far too difficult for them. And me, it's like, yeah, I can take pretty much anything at this point. So yes, I will go to the Christian university and take all of their ridiculous and stupid questions and not react in kind. Because if I can at least get the narrative out, then good, I can get the narrative out. And I know what I'm going to face when I go into that world. When I'm coming into the far left side, that part it's almost comical to me. What I love is in the town I live in, right outside of Boulder, Colorado. I'm on our town board. And I've been on the board since the 1st of April, and no one has ever mentioned ever that I'm transgender. It's just delightful that in that case, it is not the marker that causes me to be comfortable in that setting. It's the fact that we all live in the same little town.
One of the things you were just talking about is timelines, and the idea of change potentially can take generations. And so I'm curious about, as we create affinity spaces, as we create spaces to be able to support people, to be able to feel comfortable in their own bodies and their own life experiences, how do you navigate not repeating the harm? Like Paula, you were just talking about you having a congregation that was shifting towards and now becoming a queer congregation that is now I would say the word discriminating against people that are not queer. And so how do we not perpetuate that harm? How do we, if we're leading or guiding people in the creating affinity spaces, how do we create the spaces without perpetuating the harm that we've been saturated in our whole lives?
I think to focus on the difficulty of that. I'm sorry, I'm now realizing I don't think that question was addressed to me. It's fine.
Well, I mean, either. James, did you have something you want to share?
No, I had yielded to Paula. Please go ahead.
No, go ahead, James. I can come back to mine a little bit later.
Oh, well, my answer to that is when I have my conference wherever, the same thing probably happens in terms of Black and brown folks who come to my conference. The same experience possibly happens as what Paula just mentioned, that happens at her church, where there is some receptiveness, but some rejection of other folks. And the rejection comes from the acknowledgement that this is one of the few spaces that is primarily comprised of Black and brown folks that folks can come and just be. Mm-hmm. So then in those spaces, I watch people, and you see my face starting to light up, watch folks really light up and come alive in a way that's unrivaled. And what that looks like from my side, you know, I'm putting the conference together or whatever, is that when people hug each other, it kind of looks like the experience that I had when I was at Hampton University. It's, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're here. I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe we're here. So let me hold on to you until whenever. And then when it's time to go, the hug isn't like this. It's like this. It's a full embrace. And there's always a tinge of sadness that exists when folks come to my conference because they know it's going to end and they have to go. In terms of integration, on my side, I'm like, yeah, you know, come one, come all. But then for the Black and brown folks who attend, they're like, no, we want to keep it exclusively for us. And then for the white folks, they say, well, no, I don't know if I should go there. But when they go, they're like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. So I don't know, as a conference chair or a program developer, you know, what might the solution be? And maybe it is just being mindful that there are some spaces that allow for healing, that allow for growth, and that allow for a different kind of collegiality when it's racially exclusive, gender exclusive, maybe spiritually exclusive, or maybe sexually exclusive, or whatever it is. I know that at ASEC, and it seems like Quad S might do it too, they have what's called special interest groups. And the times that I've participated in the special interest groups for BIPOC professionals with ASEC, there's a lot of laughter, it's relaxed, it's easy. And for me, what that means is that sometimes Black and brown folks, or when we are in predominantly white spaces, we perform. We got to be buttoned up and got to make sure our collar is buttoned, and you know, we got to do this and got to do that. So, and part of that is because our field is built upon white supremacy. Now, that doesn't mean that the folks around us are racist, or they're biased, or they got beef with us, or anything like that. But it just means that sometimes people of color feel as if they aren't seen, and in order to be seen, they have to be white acting, or dot their I's, cross their T's, use the King's language, or whatever. When folks come to my conference, all that is off the table. All of that is off the table, because when we show up for our conference, folks will present their clinical research, their clinical best practice, their research, their pedagogy, and then, oh good, I just happen to have this next to me. We have our conferences usually at somebody's beach. We show up in our flip-flops, and when somebody says something that's profound or extraordinary, we'll actually throw our flip-flops at them, not at them to hurt them, but to acknowledge that what is significant. So, you know, we have those moments. We have many, many moments where it's formal, but possibly less formal. And I don't think the field is really ready for that decolonized experience where folks can have this scholarly exchange, but then not feel like they have to be pressured to do anything or whatever.
I am so feeling you with that. I recently attended the Alt-Sex New York City conference, and that was how the conference felt. That it was very, I mean, there's a lot of very academic, spectacular, well-referenced, cited information, but it felt comfortable. It felt like we could say anything, we could show up in any way, and it was going to be accepted, which was such a delight. And yeah.
Is this the Association of Black Sexologists? Is what I was asking you about yesterday, right?
James, would you like to speak? Someone was just asking here the name of your organization or the name of your conference.
The Association of Black Sexologists and Clinicians. And then if you go to our events page, you'll see that, you know, our next event is in Montreal. We were supposed to go to Bonaire, but flights are so damn high. So we don't, there's a lot of fluidity in what we do, and we're not put in any box that folks may not want to subscribe to.
Cool. And Paula, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about not perpetuating harm as groups are created and not perpetuating the harm that we are saturated in other spaces?
I think that actually both descriptions of the events you created or attended are exactly the solution to the larger problem. But it was when you look at this from a macro perspective, I really respect the work of the late E.O. Wilson, who taught at MIT and Harvard and won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And his first was in identifying that the key social unit for the human species is not the individual nuclear family, but that the key social unit for the human species is the tribe. And his second Pulitzer Prize was in identifying the 9 tribal species. He calls them eusocial species, EUSOCIAO. And he said, if you take a look at the evolution of those 9 species, you find 8 of the 9 evolved exactly as you would expect. He said what separates these species out is they would have what Richard Dawkins would call a selfish gene, but they also have a tribal gene. They'll sacrifice for themselves for the sake of the tribe. An enemy comes into the camp, the tribe unites, defeats the enemy, some die, but the tribe goes on. And he said the 8 of the 9 tribes have evolved exactly as you would expect. Enemy comes into the camp, tribe unites, defeats the enemy, some die, but the life goes on. He said, unfortunately, the 9th eusocial species has evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. And where no enemy exists, no naturally an enemy exists, we create one. And he said, you know, if we don't get a hold of that, we lose the species and probably lose the planet. And I think he's exactly right. And you know, if you want to get a little more on that, I think the best explanation he gave of it, the simplest to follow, is 4 or 5 years ago, a Fresh Air segment with Terry Gross, where he talked about that and how we could lose the species. So I'm very, very focused then on what is it that creates environments where we, in fact, do not create enemies that don't exist. And I think it's exactly what the 2 of you were just talking about.
Hi, Paula. Good to see you. One of the things I was thinking, you were talking about meaning as being core to the perpetuation of the human species. And I recently read a book by James Wheel that is called Recapturing the Rapture. And it's about how a lot of the problems that he thinks we're in, ecologically, population-wise, all of it, has to do with a deep loss of meaning around. And you were talking earlier about the role that story, the role that narrative plays, maybe as the bridge to bridge people who, and forgive me, so correct me if I got this wrong, but what I understood is you've got people on maybe who think one thing on one side, have one set of experiences, and somebody else on another side. And one of the things that can connect them, because it's so human, is the narrative, is the story, the impact on a person's life. I'm wondering if you could speak to, I've had the experience with you, as you know, where because of all of your experience, you could speak to me as a woman in a different way. You could say that you could do more in the world, and I felt seen. So your story and that was really impactful on me, as you know. So I'm just wondering where you tie meaning in this, all that's going on, and how that fits in with the work that you're currently doing and trying to create healing in the world. And I just would love to hear you talk about that.
Well, I believe that man's search for meaning is our commonality. That's what brings us together. Again, if you just look at it historically, anthropologically, that is when we took off as a species. As we moved from the realm of blood kin to the realm of tribe, of community. And what is it that brought us together? The assumption, you ask this of a group of undergrad students, and they'll all say it was safety. It was a need for safety that brought us together. And yet it's quite clear that it was not. It was man's search for meaning, which is why I have so much trouble with the new atheists who think that religion has always been negative. And a specific religion can, in fact, in its fundamentalist expressions, be very negative. I mean, I think right now the fundamentalist expressions of the three desert religions, which began as religions of scarcity, are wreaking havoc in our world. It tends to be fundamentalist Christianity in the United States, fundamentalist Islam in the Middle East, and even fundamentalist Judaism in some places. But those religions in their fundamentalist forms remain religions of scarcity. Thank God, in their non-fundamentalist forms, they become religions of abundance. When we see these artificial divides being created, it's really my driving interest at this point is what brings it together. And I believe it is the commonality of our story. We are a narrative-based species. You do not sleep without dreaming, and you do not dream in mathematical equations. We dream in story. The need for narrative is downright biological. And I think when we are able to get in the same room, on the same front porch, at the same dinner table, and discuss our commonalities before we discuss our differences, then I think we can counter this tendency that has become hardwired into our species over the eons to create enemies that don't exist. And one of the things I notice in my own church, and there's one specific group that I find has become the most hostile to our arriving straight white young families. And it is, in fact, what often happens to us when we have experienced a lifetime of prejudicial treatment. We then, once we find our group, just turn on the other. And so, here we are trying to live that out in a religious environment, a very, very obviously liberal Christian church, but nevertheless a church. And I look at our own failings in that and think, oh my God, are we ever going to get there? It's profoundly disappointing to me to see that a church formed just 5 years ago is already finding itself basically mirroring what Wilson has been talked about for decades.
And so, thank you. That is awesome. And a little sort of side thing. So in a moment, we're going to start shifting towards Q&A with the group. And so if anyone has questions, put them in the chat, ponder what that is so you can raise your Zoom hand. But one of the things that I'm hearing you talking about is a potential solution, is a way to engage the 8 of the tribes instead of the 1 that has become dominant, is when one is feeling discomfort, when one needs to process feelings, instead of excluding, is to invite others in, to help you process those feelings. And so am I kind of hearing you right on that? And James, do you have any thoughts about inviting people in for a communal processing of discomfort and feelings?
Paula, I didn't know if you were going to respond to that first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I believe that's exactly what has to occur. We are a transracial family, and with the passing of time, become more and more of a transracial family. And we have a lot of deep discussion. You know, I think when I first transitioned, I remember the time that my daughter, who we adopted from Calcutta, India, when she was 2 months of age, and her husband, who's from Trinidad, they both were, maybe it was a year after I transitioned, it was Christmas time. And I was talking about having just the day before experienced what is now routine every day, not being taken seriously as a woman. And my daughter, just with a twinkle in her eye, said, well, now maybe you know 1/100th of what it was like for me growing up as a brown child in a white family. And of course, you know, that led into this very, very deep and long-lasting conversation that has, I think, opened all of our eyes. But it's because it's all happening across the dinner table.
James?
Yeah, I was thinking about answering your question with a question, or responding to your question with a question. And it's inviting folks into what? So I extend you an invitation, and you're welcome to come here, or I'm welcome to go there. But then if the invitation ends up being, if I'm offered an invitation and I go to wherever you're inviting me to, and it ends up being familiar, which might be like, yeah, James, I want you to come and keynote at this conference or this conference or this conference. And I look out over the audience and everybody looks different than me, then what is the invitation for? And so chances are the invitation probably shouldn't go to me. I mean, I'm a good show, but I'm not the only show in town, right? So then the invitation possibly can go to, say, an HBCU or a Hispanic serving institution, where we know that there are a number of people of color who are or might be interested into the profession. The invitation might be extended to people who wouldn't have access to us. So if we lower our rates, right, then maybe Black and brown folks might have a different set of opportunities to resolve their issues. So I'm convenient, I'm easy, I'm highly accessible. And, you know, I mean, I do accept invitations all the time, but then that doesn't really solve the issue. And it's unfortunate that, you know, in this day and age, that we don't, as a field and as a community, we're not ready to really offer invitations to people who could really use or might want the invitation.
I heard that. I'm just processing and feeling that in myself right now. One of the last questions I want to ask before we open for group questions is, potentially, if one is traumatized, and I want to, of course, support someone in the healing around the trauma, but if someone is traumatized, if we shift towards an inclusive community processing model, where potentially one or more people that can be of the group that created the trauma are at the table, how could that potentially be done without re-traumatizing, or without dishonoring the fear, the genuine fear that someone would have of being re-traumatized in that community setting?
I don't think it is always possible to do that. I mean, we all work with folks at different levels of working through their trauma. And there are environments I would not want to see a lot of my clients stepping into, not now and not for a long time. You know, I appreciate the work of Jonathan Haidt, particularly in his book, The Righteous Mind, not so much his later book. Well, he has a new one coming out that looks pretty interesting, but not the Coddling of the American Mind was not my favorite book, but The Righteous Mind. He said, well into the book, I think maybe the most important line in the book. People will change their minds, but not unless information comes to them in a non-threatening way. And again, that's why I go back to narrative, finding our commonality. And if we can find that which is the same, we breathe, we eat, we stand in awe of nature. If we can find that commonality, then we can begin the conversation. But when we have been traumatized, we can't have eyes to see the commonality. All we have eyes to see is the threat. And when we are, in fact, threatened, everything else shuts down.
James?
My response would be, I think in a perfect world, we'd all get together and have a conversation. But I think the starting point is people having a conversation with themselves and thinking about how they've contributed to the systemic dysfunction, including myself. I've contributed to it as well. And the way that I contribute to it is my own internalized white supremacy and my own mismanagement of my whiteness. I said that in supervision last week and folks looked at me like I was crazy. Yeah, I struggle managing my whiteness. And I think in those reflective times and thinking about how we contributed to the dysfunction of the field, hopefully there is a query into how I or we manage our sense of privilege, our notions of entitlement, the capacity to offer others access. So let me use an example. So I live here in Philadelphia, and I shared with actually my supervisees, I said, do you know that I can go through or major in psychology, get my master's degree in social work, counselor education, or psychology, and then earn my PhD, PsyD, EDD, go on to get certified and licensed or earn some sort of certification or whatever. I said, I can get those credentials, and in Philadelphia, I can establish a private practice, move myself from, here, I live in West Philadelphia, move myself from West Philadelphia into Center City in Rittenhouse, which is, kind of hoity-toity. And I said, if I move my office over there, I could position myself to never come into contact with people of color. How could I do that? I can raise my rates to $250 to $350 to $550 a session, and then chances are there'll be very few, if any, people of color come down the pipeline. So we know that race is sometimes tied to socioeconomic status. And because we continue to give our students books that only highlight the accomplishments of white folks, we are led to believe that people of color haven't contributed anything to the field, which is somewhat myopic and misguided. And so when I bring it up, folks are looking at me like, oh, well, yeah, well, who else is there, James? And so then I say, well, why do I have to do your work?
That's right.
So then I sit back, and again, I'm convenient. I'm so convenient because I'm out there. You can Google me, you can find me. I like to think I'm a pretty nice guy, and I'll hang out with you. We'll have drinks, we'll eat or whatever. We'll see you at the conference. I'm gonna hug you, love you up, whatever. But then again, if I'm the only show in town, that's a problem. So there's only two of us, Black certified sex therapist supervisors in the world. And at least from one organization, I'll call them out, ASAC, has been around for 55, 56, 57 years. What are we doing? But then we have these different committees that tout diversity, equity, inclusion. Like, really, what are we doing? Really, what are we doing? So, again, the invitation can go to a few, but then we really have to think through how we position ourselves and how we show up in the field. Because without getting in touch with our own identities and without having an understanding of how those identities impact the people around me, then I'm only doing what the folks have been doing probably for the past 100 years, which is excluding folks, keeping folks on the margin, but then, you know, I can have a successful career. And again, not even come across any Black or brown folks along the way.
So I'm loving this conversation, and I wish we could keep going for 5 hours, but of course want to honor your time. And I also want to see if there are any questions from the students. Do students have any questions?
I think that's exactly the topic though that needs to be discussed, because I think that's an important one.
Unpack that for you, if you could.
Well, I think it's just access. I think there is limited access to people of color, to ASECT in particular. You know, it's a very cumbersome program to access, certificate to access. It's very costly, and you know, the Black and brown sex therapists that I'm aware of, or that I've been aware of through I didn't even know it was James's certificate organization, but I've been aware of them through Clubhouse. Through Clubhouse. And we've had a lot of conversation about how ASEX feels discriminatory to them. I think it's a very important conversation.
I've been speaking with Marietta Gary Smith, who runs ASEX BIPOC SIG, special interest group that James was referring to. And since both of us are in Oregon, I was asking, well, could we do an Oregon discussion panel meeting, something? And part of their feeling was that the only way that we could have critical mass is if we keep it national, because currently there's such a feeling of exclusion, and there isn't enough ASEC membership to be able to have an Oregon conversation. And the people that are in Oregon that are therapists are not joining ASEC because of the feeling of exclusion over the decades. And so we can't have the grassroots sort of in each city work that we want to do, we currently can't do because of the massive amount, the decades of discrimination, the decades of making people feel like outsiders. And so we currently are stuck in a national conversation.
And it's not just ASEC. I mean, it's other organizations and other levels as well. I was doing sports psychology before I switched into sex therapy, and it's the same dynamic. What they did from that level was say, like, so we shouldn't just be doing psychologists only. We should like allow social work master's level clinicians to do the same level of work, because that changes the access. But this is different, because it's also educators and master's level clinicians, but the credentialing itself is so cumbersome and costly. What did you tell me? It cost $15,000 for you to get that credentialing or something?
Yeah, I think basically for me to become ASEC certified in total is probably like $12,000 worth of random fees and time and stuff.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I just think that, Paula, you could speak to how I think the church is struggling with this around race as well, that in the more liberal churches, the more progressive churches are very white, and they're trying to figure out how to be more, what their stuff is that's keeping it out, which I think is all of this stuff that we've been talking about. But James, you brought up sort of the importance of looking within and doing our own, paying attention and noticing what's going on for me, what's my work. And one of the things I see is that when people have come from really traumatic experiences and lives and generations, whether that's from how the church has been abusive, or whether that's from racial experiences or whatever, the reactivity within often is what is shaping the conversation, as opposed to everybody just sitting and looking and listening and seeing what's happening in their body and wondering what that's about, and then wondering how safe space can be created, or what is needed right now in order to create movement so that relationships can occur. I don't know if either one of you want to speak to that, but I certainly see this happening in multiple areas of my own life.
Paula? I was going to say that about 2 years ago, there was a lot of civic unrest in our country. And then it filtered down through my clients and filtered down into supervision, where, we had a chance to talk about some of the systemic unrest that happened here in Philadelphia. And so, as I venture out and, move into, some spaces that are predominantly white, I'll say to them that, in my journey to, get credentialed and certified and licensed and yada, 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 all of my supervisors are white. And well, no. I had one Black supervisor. And I said, maybe diversity and inclusion comes from the field's willingness to find supervisors who have a different set of identities than what they have, meaning that there are now probably like 6 or 7 of us who are ASEC certified supervisors, whether it's educators, counselors, or therapists. And, it blows me away for about the number of people who want to give me a hug when I see them at the conference. And I say, well, yeah, how's supervision going for you? And they'll complain that their supervisors aren't in tune with what's going on with the identities that they take on and how those identities inform their clinical practice. But then yet and still, they don't call any one of the supervisors of color. So again, if we look within and think about our own ambivalence or reticence around, inviting people into our space to help us get from point A to point B, then really, what are we doing?
Right.
So I was wondering, you're both welcome to hang out. We will be shifting from official panel discussion to the group conversation. You're welcome to stay if you want, but in no way do I want to pressure you in any way. But I was wondering if you have any closing thoughts on the conversation we were just having for the last hour.
I just want to thank you for having me. It's been really good listening and taking this in. I have to go back to the other stuff that I've been working on today. But just thank you so much for giving me a chance to be with you.
Of course. Our pleasure, really, truly.
And thank you as well for the opportunity to be in this space with you all. And I'm hoping that our paths cross soon. And if I see you out there, shake your hand, give you a hug with consent, and really wish you the best of luck in everything that you endeavor.
Well, thank you so much. I welcome the hug if and when in the future. And I look forward to many more conversations and collaborations, whether they're 30 minutes or 20 hours long.